All right. Welcome back, guys, to another NDS squad chat. Today, we're fortunate enough to have Lyndon Krause from Tennis Lab in Victoria present a little bit about rackets and strings. Lyndon's worked with a lot of the players, continues to do so, and if you're ever in Melbourne, he's located the indoor courts, right at the end of the indoor courts. He's tucked away at the back there, where, you know, if you guys are ever there and want to ask a few questions or even sign up to do some testing with Lyndon, he is available for many of the players across the country. So I'll pass it over to Lyndon. Thanks for your time, mate, and look forward to watching you prezzo.
Thanks, Sandon, and thanks for having me, everyone. So today, what I want to have a chat through is what we call or consider the underdogs of our sport, which is rackets and strings. There's actually more to it as well. So consider it the equipment that you use. So racket, strings, tension, even to the extent of how you regrip a racket. So what I have here is just a quick video. So for those who are unfamiliar with the Tennis Lab and what we do, this is a great, I think it might be even 10, 20-second clip of what some of the things that we do. So as you see, it might be a little bit laggy, but basically we have a series of different technologies that we use to measure the equipment that players use. We can run them through on-court tests with our Hawkeye court, which gives real-time analytics on, you know, your performance characteristics around power, spin, control that you can produce with different rackets and so forth. And then we have a number of other pieces of equipment which we use to customize equipment to make it really tailored to our players' needs, to make sure that when they walk out on court, they're getting the very best out of their game. So the objective of today, I just wanted to try and keep it relatively simple and really highlight the importance of making correct equipment choices and what that means for your game. So part one, I just wanted to quickly touch on the notion that finding the perfect equipment is a really, really difficult task. And there's a number of reasons to why this is difficult, which I'll touch on shortly. But first, I just want to introduce you to why Tennis Lab was created. So Tennis Lab is really the solution to one key statistic, which is that 80% of players are currently using equipment, so racket or strings, that are suboptimal to their game. So what I mean by that statement is that through our research on over 500 players on our Hawkeye court, we basically found that 80% of players could gain something, be it more power, more spin, more control, out of a racket or string change. So through Tennis Lab, our mission is to basically reverse this statistic so that we have at least 80% of players using the right equipment. And obviously, to get to that stage is going to take a long time. And this presentation is just one of those things where you guys can hopefully learn a little bit and let's start creeping that statistic along. So the question I always get asked is, why do so few players have the right equipment? And there's two, I guess this is probably one of the primary reasons, which is there's just so many different types of racket, types of string available on the market. So for kids, and these are all junior rackets, so anything 26 inches or less, there's basically almost 60,000 different combinations of just the racket alone when you're looking at the head size, the string pattern, the racket mass, and so forth. And then when you look at adults rackets, which is predominantly used by any player from the age of 12 and older, there's over 1 million different combinations before we even add string to the racket. So automatically what you can see there is it becomes a really, really difficult scenario for someone to walk into a store and purchase the right racket. And the other part of the equation is that we've done some questionnaires with a number of players and asked around their equipment habits and how they actually look to change their equipment. And what we found was that on average, a national performance player will spend around 675 hours practicing on court each year, but only 1 hour selecting their equipment, be it racket or string. So as you can see there, there's quite a big difference in the amount of time that they spend on court versus the amount of time that they're actually looking at their racket and so forth, which is quite an interesting statistic given what you'll see over the next coming slides. Which brings me to part 2, the importance of optimized equipment. So one of the, I guess, the most well-recognized racket changes in the history of the sport was Roger Federer. So when he changed in 2013 from his smaller 90 head size Pro Staff to 2014, where he basically changed his racket to a 97 head size. So he went bigger head size, slightly thicker beam width, and a slightly lower swing weight. So in effect, what those 3 key changes were was it gives him a bigger sweet spot. The racket became slightly stiffer, which is the result of the thicker beam, which translates to typically more power. And the lower swing weight gives more maneuverability, so it makes the racket easier to swing. And the result of that, so here we can see on his first and second serve statistics, we actually, as I mentioned, his first serve speed on average went up, or maximum speed increased by around 4 kilometers an hour, and his second serve speed by 6 kilometers an hour. So you can already see, even at the absolute pinnacle of the sport in Roger Federer, a slight change to his equipment, and they're not big changes. The racket itself is relatively similar, but there is some considerable performance outcomes that he achieved. A second case in point is Sam Stosur, who's actually one of the first athletes we worked with. So remember, Sam's a player she at the time played with the same racket for over 10 years. And what we did is we basically got her in, asked her priorities, so it was more power and more spin. And then we sorted 10 rackets that we thought would help her achieve that, and we got her out on a Hawkeye court to understand how each racket would behave. And to be honest, the immediate impact was quite substantial. So what we were finding was that a 2 to 5% increase in ball speed and a 7 to 10% increase in spin, with no real loss in control for Sam compared to a current racket. So the key here is remembering it. This is compared to a racket that she's used for 10 years. And she's literally just picked these other ones up for about 20 shots. So you can see already that even in such a short amount of time, there's a significant gain that can be made from having an equipment change. Another part of the equation, and this one I find is actually really, really important. So there's 2 equations to selecting the right equipment, right? So you obviously want the racket that's going to perform at its maximum, but at the same time, you have to be able to have confidence in your equipment every time you go on court, right? So what I like to think about like this is that, sure, you could have the best performing racket in the world, but if it feels like a board or a piece of timber every time you go out to play, there's a fair chance you're not going to have the utmost confidence in it. So sometimes we might have to give and trade away a little bit. And that's what we did with Dylan Alcott. So basically, he came to us saying, I like my current setup, but I feel it could benefit from a bit more feel and depth on my shots. We did actually find a racket that suited him a little bit more, but it didn't have that feel component to it. So what we then looked at doing was, is there a different way we can gain some performance benefits for him? So we tried the racket change. It didn't necessarily work as we'd hoped. But then we started looking at his string. So we actually dropped tension quite considerably from 55 to 42 pounds. And then the second part of the equation was we also changed the combination of his string to help him with a little bit more shape on his shots. So that's a prime example of where performance is really important, and we still got a performance change without changing the racket, but we also improved his confidence in his equipment at the same time. And the last part of the equation, and this is, to me, the utmost importance, which is injury prevention. So if you get injured when you play tennis, you're not playing, which is a major problem. So the racket can actually contribute to a player's injury, and typically those injuries are ones related to the shoulder, wrist, and elbow. So Jamie Forless, one of our National Academy players in our pro circuit, she was one we worked with her for a number of months. Basically, when she came to us, she had 6 months of no tennis and restricted training loads. And we tried a number of things. Firstly, we tried string and so forth. That didn't really work. So what we ended up deciding was the best scenario was a whole change of racket. The outcome was basically a racket that was bigger in head size, less in mass, lower in swing rate, and we increased the stiffness just a little bit as well. With the whole aim of that being around trying to decrease the loading on her shoulder and arm. And what we found then now is she's basically playing without that injury permanently. The second case study here is Andrew Harris. So similar injury to Jamie. So he was again 6 months no tennis and 12 months heavily restricted loads when he first came to us. He ironically though really loved his current racket and wasn't really that keen on moving away from that. So what we had to do with him was try and find a way to decrease the load on his body every time he swung his racket. So what we actually did is, you can look at the picture on the right hand side there, is we actually had to trim part of his bumper off to bring the mass down and swing weight down a little bit. So you might have seen Andrew playing with this racket for, I guess, the best part of 12 months. And again, that's definitely helped his body and get it right. So now we're actually at the stage where we can start adding a little bit more mass to his racket again, because he is playing every day now. So part 3 of the equation is equipment optimization. And I like to think about it, it's like owning a car. So I've got these 3 key ingredients and there's a process to just getting it right. And then the final touches make it much better. So I'll sort of talk to what this means now, but the process, as I said, is like purchasing and maintaining a car. So consider the purchase of the car or the vehicle is like your racket, your string, whatever it is, right? So your purchase is ultimately always aligned to your priorities and your needs. So if you have an injury, there's certain rackets that won't be well suited to you. If you're looking for power, there'll be rackets that are more suited to you than other rackets. It's the same with a car. If you've got 7 kids, you're not gonna be able to have a sports car that's only got 2 seats. It's the same with a racket. So the first part is aligning your purchase and racket priorities with your performance priorities. The second part is understanding the upgrades. So when you purchase a new car, you might have the choice to have your windows tinted or have a sunroof or things that make your life a little bit better and your car a little bit fancier, right? You can also do the same thing to your racket. So the upgrade is considered like your strings or your tension. So these are the parts of your racket or your equipment that you can manipulate to increase or improve the overall performance and suitability to your needs. And then the last part of the equation is the service. So with your car, in order to, I guess, have it perform at its optimal for a long period of time, you need to make sure it's maintained and up to date. And it's the same with your equipment. So if you're not doing that, you run the risk of a breakdown. So, you might be up in a Grand Slam match at 5-all and you haven't restrung your racket and then you break a string and you end up losing. And that just comes from poor equipment and servicing type habits. The other part of the equation there is maintaining your equipment in a way that all your rackets are identical. So what we can do as professionals in this industry is 2 rackets off the shelf. They might look identical, but almost always they'll be different in one of the key categories of mass, balance, swing weight, or head size. And we can actually make some small adjustments to your rackets by adding lead tape, adding silicone, to make sure those things are identical. So every single time you go onto the court, your rackets will always perform the same. So when it comes to equipment and the optimization, there are 3 key elements which I sort of talked to before, which are having the right racket, the right string, and the right tension. So I'm going to try and talk through each of these 3 key elements briefly now. So starting with rackets. So basically tennis rackets, there's 2 main types of specification of your racket. So there's the fixed specification, which are the things that you can't change. So these are the stiffness of the racket, the head size of the racket, and the string pattern of the racket. So if you ever want to change any of those things, you'll need to change your racket. The non-fixed specifications are the things I was talking about earlier. So these are the physical attributes of a racket, which you can change via customization. So this is the mass of the racket. So we can always make the mass heavier. We can, in some cases, like Andrew Harris' example before, lighter, but that's a lot harder. We can change the balance of a racket. So the balance of a racket is basically whether your racket is head light or head heavy. Swing weight, imagine swing weight is how heavy your racket is to swing. So, and the way we can change that through lead tape. So if you put more lead tape at the top of your racket, it's going to become harder to swing than if we put it in the handle of your racket. The length of your racket is obviously how long your racket is. A longer racket might give you more power and spin, but the subsequent of that is it reduces your maneuverability. Now, one thing I'll say with length is if you want to go longer in length, it can be done, but I highly recommend against that. You're actually better off purchasing a racket that's already longer. So the reason behind that is because once we add length to a racket, there's two main things that can happen. One, the handle can break because a lot of pressure goes through that last bit of the racket. Or secondly, as you increase the racket's length, swing weight increases dramatically, which will make it a lot harder to swing, increases the risk for injury, and also at the same time decreases the maneuverability of the racket. So we often find players that come in, they want their racket lengthened. We can do it depending on the racket and so forth, but then they come back and ask for it to be shortened again because it is a very, very big change. And then the last part of the racket is the grip size. So having the right grip size basically means optimal performance as well. So having a grip size that's too big might mean you overgrip the racket, too small, you might also overgrip the racket and whatever else. When it comes to selecting the right grip size, I'm much of the opinion of there's no real right or wrong, but it's whatever feels most comfortable to you. So this is the question. This is ultimately the goal question. So what is the perfect racket setup for a player? So I bring it down to three key things. So basically what we want to achieve is the heaviest racket that a player can swing indefinitely, so for a long period of time without compromising any of these three key things. So that one is, number one, is we don't want to compromise their technique. So that's something that you might need to liaise with your coach with because it's obviously quite difficult to see what you're doing yourself on court, but the coach will pick that up quite quickly. The second part is compromising racket head speed. So we don't want racket head speed to become too slow or too fast because that's going to increase your likelihood for injury. And then the last part is the obvious one. We don't want the racket to cause injury or soreness. So if you ever pick up a racket and within 30 minutes to an hour you felt a little bit of tightness in your arm or shoulder, I recommend definitely not using that racket. And as I mentioned before, so for performance players, if you get these three things right, that's a great start, but there's always the fourth step, which is to make sure your racket, to customize them for optimal performance. So that's where we do slight manipulations to the swing weight of the racket. We might add a little bit more mass or that sort of thing. So part two is strings. So strings is really quite a mythical beast for some players. I'm just going to touch on the string construction. So this doesn't necessarily mean a lot to most players, but what I want to point out here is that there are a number of different constructions to a string, right? So there might be strings that are just like your monofilament up the top here. So it's basically one solid string the whole way through. Then you've got your solid core single wrap, which is a solid string in the middle, but they've got coils around the outside. So the main difference is, I guess, the more tiny little fibers you have, the softer the string will typically be. But as a result of it being softer, it's more likely to break faster, but it's also going to be more powerful. So there's all these number of different combinations that the manufacturers will produce in their strings. I guess the thing to note here is that just be aware that there's so many different things. So sometimes you might pick up a string and it breaks really fast. That doesn't always mean a multi-filament is going to break fast, because it might be this type of multi-filament whereas there might also be multi-filaments that look like this, which will have more durability for a little bit longer period of time. Equally, some textured strings might have dimples, some might have more edges, so they're what we call geometric type strings. But ultimately, what does that mean when it comes to performance? We can actually break it down into 3 main categories of string, which are, if we're just looking at the grass, so we've got polyester strings in, what's that, salmon pink, right? It's so the polyester string is the string used by probably over 90% of professional players now. So the reason they predominantly use that is it's got great durability. Ball speed, you can see it's a little bit lower than the other multi-filament and natural gut type strings. But what that means, it allows the players to take really big swings at the ball and produce a lot more spin. The side effect of that, though, is the dynamic stiffness of the strings is quite high, which means they'll play a little bit less comfortable. Equally, for players with injury, having a full bed of polyester isn't always recommended. So that's where you might look at hybriding a polyester with either multi-filament or a natural gut. So synthetic gut also would fall into the multi-filament category here, which is the blue, and then natural gut is the yellow. And basically what we see is as the string becomes more powerful, its ability to produce spin typically decreases. Now that's based off its elastic property. So thinking about 2 types of string here. So one is like a rubber band, which is your natural gut and multi-filament. So it will deform a lot and it will snap back into place quite efficiently. And it will just do that for its whole life until it breaks. The other type of string is a polyester, which I mentioned before. This has elastic properties. So every time you stretch a polyester, it will just get longer. It won't necessarily return to its shape. It will just keep getting longer and longer and longer until it can't get any longer, and then that's when it breaks. But as the side effect of that, because it is plastic, it means it slides across itself a lot easier. And it's also, they also typically have smooth coatings to increase that, which is why they can produce more spin than other strings. And then the last one. So this is, I really love this slide often when I present it, but basically just again, don't worry about the text on the screen, but there's 3 types of string shape. So there's round, rough, and edged. And typically most players will pick an edged string. So something like a poly to a spin, which has, you know, it's hexagonal, sharp edges. You would imagine it would produce more spin. Those strings actually provide the least amount of spin of any strings we've tested. Whereas round strings provide a little bit more, and then the rough coated strings will typically provide the most amount of spin. So it sounds counterintuitive, but the reason behind that is spin is produced by the ability of your strings to move across each other and then snap back quickly, which is what provides the RPM on the ball. So edge strings actually decrease the ability of the strings to slide across each other. So they're more likely to cut into each other and produce less spin. Rough strings, the way they're actually formulated, it actually increases that ability to slide across each other. So rough strings are typically by shape more oval than round. So part 4, tension. So firstly, I just wanted to touch on how does tension affect your performance? Well, basically tension does 2 things. So the main thing it does is it will change how it feels off your strings, right? So above anything else, the feel will be the most dramatic change that you as the player will feel. So here's an example though of where we actually dropped tension by 10 pounds from 44 to 54. Now this test was undertaken with 30 elite coaches. So their ball striking is pretty good. And as you can see from the average ball speed, they're hitting the ball pretty hard. But with both strings, we can see average ball speed was only around 1 kilometer difference for a lower tension. Ball spin was actually also very similar, only 100 RPM difference. But the biggest difference is actually in the landing depth. So a lower tension will increase landing depth if we decrease tension by 10 pounds by around a foot, which from a tactical perspective is good to know, because it means if you typically struggle to find depth on your shots, a lower tension and I'm not talking here like a 1 or 2 pound difference. That's not going to make a big difference, but a 10-pound difference is still only going to give you a foot of change in depth on average. So I guess the key takeaway from here is don't be afraid to experiment with big tension changes. So from, if you're currently playing with 54 and you're a junior, a 44-pound change isn't necessarily as huge as it sounds. Now, I'm not saying within a match you would change strings between 10 pounds, but it's something to experiment with. And the other part of the equation there is I've just got that consistently restringing your rackets means consistent performance, because what you will find is that when you restring a racket, they actually lose tension very fast. So it's about 20% within the first day of tension loss, which 20% can almost be 10 pounds. So that's where your foot of difference would happen. And this is a common question as well I get. So what tension should I restring my rackets at? Well, interestingly enough, majority of rackets these days have a recommended tension range. So that's a good place to start. It's not the be all or end all, but basically if you're using soft strings like a multi-filament or natural gut, we recommend stringing at least as your first starting point in the center of the range. Or alternatively, if you're using a stiffer string, polyester, Kevlar, those type of strings, string in the lower value range. So in this example, it's 52 for a softer string and 49 for a stiffer string. And then you can adjust from there based off your feel. So if you feel like you need more control and less comfort, you can go slightly higher tension, maybe 3 pounds, lower tension, so that will give you more power or more comfort. Equally, the other thing to consider is the actual ambient conditions. So in hotter conditions like Australian summer, you're probably going to need to have a higher tension, because what it does is the ball, as the ball heats up, it will be more susceptible to flying off the strings. The strings themselves will soften a little bit, so it's more likely to fly. Equally, in cold conditions, everything becomes less lively. So again, you might actually want to decrease your string tension to help counter for that. And this is one of the biggest things that I see that a lot of players could do better. So year round, I'll often see National Academy players stringing at 52 in the middle of winter, but then also stringing at 52 in the middle of summer. That makes no sense when you consider what I've just said, right? So have a think about potentially that in winter, you might want to have your tension set a little bit lower because the conditions are less lively, but then in summer, be able to adjust that as well. So how do you know when it's time to restring your racket? Basically, the reason you need to restring your racket is because strings lose their resilience, so their ability to snap back into the original shape, which has benefits around power and spin, as well as the comfort. So the comfort will change across a string job as well, which ultimately can inhibit the playability that you feel. So the most obvious one is when you have a broken string that needs to be restrung. The second one is when you have compromised snapback. So as you'll see in the picture there, you've got the strings no longer sit in a straight line. So they look more like spaghetti. So that's another reason that you might restring. Deep notching or fraying, so you can actually pull your strings back, and if you see something like that where they've really deeply notched, probably around halfway through, that's a good sign as well that your strings are about to break and it's probably time for a restring. So how do you know when it's time to change your equipment? I've got here a checklist. So this is something we like to do with the majority of our athletes every time we talk to them. Basically, I'll leave this here and I'll send this through as well to Sandon so you can share it with the group. But basically, there's these 6 key questions. And if you answer yes to any of the below questions, it's probably a good time for you to start reviewing your equipment and your setup. So for instance, if you purchase your racket because your favorite player uses it, there's a fair chance that that racket's not going to be suited to you, because not many people have a swing like Rafa, so it doesn't, so Rafa's racket isn't typically going to suit the majority of players and so forth. As I mentioned before, question 3, if you experience arm or shoulder pain, this is an absolute red flag. And this is probably the one I would consider the most important when looking at changing equipment above all else. And the last one I've got there is I last restrung my racket over 3 months ago. So as performance players, at a bare minimum, I think from what I've seen anyway, typically you should be looking to restring your rackets at least once every month. So some key takeaways from today. The first one is that finding the right equipment is difficult. So that's where, we don't expect you to be able to do this yourself. That's where you can reach out to us and other experts in the field to help you with that, and your coaches as well. Having the right equipment can actually be game-changing, either from an injury perspective, so actually physically getting you on the court more often, or from a performance perspective, as I mentioned, such as Roger's example, Sam Stosur, Dylan Alcott, and so forth. And then when looking for the right equipment, you must consider 3 key elements. So the racket, the string, and the tension, and how they all interact with each other as well. So changing racket, the one thing I forgot to mention before is that changing rackets doesn't always mean that that you'll continue using the same string or tension that you used previously. It just doesn't work like that, because that's like trying to fit 4-wheel drive tires on a sports car. It just doesn't work. So the last thing I want to leave you with as well is, so we've just launched a digital support system for helping players select the right equipment, so racket and string for their game. So this isn't publicly available yet, but if you do want any assistance, we can walk you through this. Just email tennislab@tennis.com.au, or you can send us a message to our Instagram page if that's easier, and we can get you started on that process. So again, this is something I'd recommend, at least even if you don't want to change your racket, it might be worthwhile just touching base, and we can do the string recommendation with you, because we actually have found it does make a difference. So yeah, that's it from today. Hopefully we touched on a few key items. There's always more that I can talk to, but hopefully it's helpful.
Oh, mate, that was awesome. I think just as you went into, Lyndon, just a nice little overview of pretty much everything with the technology of rackets and strings. I mean, there's just so much out there. That was surprising to me that with the rackets, as you said, there's, I guess, a million options. That's quite a large number. I didn't expect it to be that big, but I think, for most of the kids and coaches, really important, as you said, it may be 5-10% change in some different change, with some different technology where it's going to benefit their games. I think something that the pros do an amazing job, and it just keeps getting better and better, is making those little adjustments, those little 1%ers. We can always make the little 1%ers on court, and they're controllables, and this is something that is a controllable as well. We always talk to the kids about having something that we can control in our sport, and definitely racket technology and having that knowledge is something that we can always learn, and it's the sports science component of our sport, which keeps evolving.
Yeah, totally. I think the other thing I forgot to add there as well is just that when it comes to, I'll send through a video. We had a discussion with Sam Stosur, so the kids can watch that as well. But the other thing, and she brought it up herself, is that don't be fearful to change equipment, because you can always go back to what you had. So she used that as a great example of, it is daunting when you're looking at changing equipment, and you feel like most times you might not have time to change equipment because you are constantly playing, constantly touring, and so forth. But always remember in the back of your mind that if you've got nothing to lose. So you can test the piece of equipment, didn't feel as good, didn't perform as well, easy, just go back to what you had. So yeah, that's the last thing I want to leave you with. But I think that's some real wisdom from Sam there.
No, that's awesome. Well, mate, yeah, look, really appreciate your time. And as you said, any of the kids or coaches that want more information from you or get in touch, or I mean, obviously it's on this chat, but I can also pass on their details to you, Lyndon, or questions as well. So I appreciate your
Yeah,
time. Thanks for coming on and sharing your wisdom and
no
knowledge.
problems. Thanks, Sandon. Thanks all.